I absolutely love roguelites, and I play a lot of them. Because it's the end of the year, it's time to do some quick reviews of all the roguelites and roguelikes that I played this year. So let's get into it. Let's start off with Hadean Tactics, a roguelite that fuses auto-battler and card game elements. Starting with your hero, you build up a team of units that auto-battle enemies. Every 7 seconds, the game pauses and allows you to play cards that buff your units, damage enemies, or other fun effects, like throwing enemies across the grid. During your run, you upgrade your units, manage and upgrade cards, and unlock relics that allow familiar passive upgrades or niche effects. Hadean Tactics does a good job of using those auto-battler and card game mechanics. It's a solid auto-battler, and it's a solid deck builder. I liked a lot of the different builds and teams that I made with the different heroes and different hero variants. The game also has a unique custom hero mechanic and deck building systems, along with that familiar difficulty levels to climb. But at the same time, Hadean Tactics doesn't do anything to take those concepts to the next level. It's a fun, novel fusion that I still recommend, but there are both better deck builders out there and better auto-battlers. Balatro is a poker-inspired roguelite that absolutely blew up in the broader gaming sphere. At its core, Balatro is about playing the best hand you can in order to get the most points. However, the simple gameplay gets deep very quickly when you start collecting jokers, which are powerful cards that combo with the hands you play, synergize with each other, and open up a large amount of build crafting variety. You can tweak your starting set of cards by upgrading, modifying, and removing cards from your deck. I loved Balatro, and it's one of my favorite games in this video. It's super easy to pick up, which makes it great for a broader audience. But it also has surprisingly deep build crafting that makes it great for an audience more familiar with card games and roguelites. The different types of decks, the collection style progression, and the other unique elements add some nice replayability. Ultimately, the game is limited by that same simple core gameplay loop that makes it so accessible, as well as how impactful early game RNG feels as you climb difficulty levels. But those complaints only started to arise for me after I'd sunk quite a few hours into this game. And I strongly recommend trying it if you haven't already. There's a reason Balatro was nominated for Game of the Year and won multiple awards, including Best Indie Game. Next, Deadlink is a fast-paced FPS roguelite with core gameplay similar to Movement or hero shooters. That core gameplay is really great. You have a lot of fun classes that feel truly distinct. It's a cross between games like Doom Eternal and Overwatch, with super enjoyable shooting and character abilities that have you frantically zooming around the map and killing enemies. For that core gameplay alone, I would recommend Deadlink to FPS fans, but the roguelite elements are downhill from there. The build crafting has a mix of standard elements and a one-of-a-kind chip and module system that I quite liked conceptually, but never quite got into. I never had satisfying builds from it. The enemy designs are good, but the run structures feel formulaic, and the bosses are always the same. There's also a lot of vertical progression, which lacks some important upgrades behind a little too much playtime. And finally, it's also set in a cyberpunk world with lore and voice-acted NPCs that add some nice world building, but don't build to any satisfying conclusion. So these other elements are all good enough that they don't ruin Deadlink, but Deadlink's definitely riding on that core gameplay, which, to be fair, is pretty incredible. Heretic Fork is a tower defense game with some bullet heaven vibes. In this game, you defend a core tower from waves of enemies coming at you. To do that, you play different defense structures that auto-target enemies. Every turn, you can play cards that usually have stacking passive effects, but can also upgrade your towers, have active abilities, or other niche effects. Uniquely, your deck in Heretic Fork has constant turnover, because you're able to merge cards together to create more powerful cards of higher tiers. You can also play as different employees or characters that have unique abilities and mechanics. I quite liked Heretic Fork for what it was. It's a pretty simple game, but I really enjoy the unique card upgrading mechanic. You're constantly deciding when you want to play cards and when you want to merge them together. You're constantly working with that RNG of what cards to pick next and deciding how to best flesh out your build for a given run. That being said, it's not a game I got a ton of playtime out of. It has some unbalanced builds, a couple of progression points I didn't like, and a couple areas that don't feel well polished, though some of those have been addressed with the recent update. It's worth a playthrough for a short time, but just don't expect too much out of it. Knight vs. Giant: The Broken Excalibur is a very solid, fast-paced action roguelite that deserves more attention than it got. The core gameplay loop involves clearing waves of enemies before getting to the mini-boss and moving on to the next area. You have a basic attack, a spell, and an active ability you use while frantically dodging the enemy's fast attacks. You get a build that enhances the base moveset of each knight, adding additional effects ranging from simple stat increases to new condition effects or adding a stun to an ability. Altogether, Knight's First Giant is a good action roguelite. It's fast-paced, it forces a lot of dodging and movement, and it feels rewarding to master. It also has some of the better story elements that I've seen in a roguelite, though not on the level of a game like Hades. Negatives-wise, the fast-paced combat can be frustrating when learning and create some visual clarity problems. The build crafting is fun, but also fairly tame and on the rails. And while the game does everything well enough, it doesn't wow in any particular area. There's no X factor that's amazing and sells the game. I still think it's worth grabbing at some point if you're an action roguelite fan, especially if you want that fast-paced combat. Cobalt Core is one of those games that gives you good vibes whenever you play it. It's a card game where you control a ship with 3 crewmates, each of whom add more cards into a common deck. It has standard deck builder roguelite mechanics with card upgrades, relics, and a branching overworld. Where Cobalt Core really stands out, combat-wise, is the tactical element of controlling your ship, where you often move left and right to hit enemies and avoid attacks. You can also launch drones and manage asteroids, clogging up the battlefield. At its core, Cobalt Core is a solid deck builder roguelite with some easy to learn but surprisingly deep tactical elements around where and when to move your ship around. It does all the gameplay things well, and it tops it off with some great characters that made me chuckle, and some nice narrative elements to explore that give background to your characters that are stuck in a time loop. My only main criticism of this game is that it's missing a bit content-wise in terms of playstyle variety due to overlapping crewmates across runs, and also the enemy and boss variety is a little disappointing. It should be noted, though, that they have addressed that enemy and boss variety with some more recent updates. With that caveat in mind, I'd still recommend Cobalt Core for any fan of deck builder roguelites, especially if you want a tactical twist or some entertaining characters. Up next, Inkbound was probably my sleeper hit of the year. I had low expectations, given some negative sentiment around this game's launch, but it turned into one of my go-to comfort games for the year. Inkbound is a turn-based roguelite, but it feels very fluid and quick. You play as different characters who have both a unique set of abilities and draw from a pool of common abilities across characters. You stack these abilities together each turn before the enemies react. I really love the build crafting in this game, which focuses on upgrading your abilities with additional effects, collecting vestiges, which have various passive or triggerable effects, and most uniquely, the vestige set mechanic. All vestiges have set effects, and if you have enough vestiges of a certain set, you unlocked buffed effects, like poison relics, giving increased poison damage through the poison set effects. We can also sacrifice vestiges at certain points to get more of that set effect, which allows for some strategic choices that I haven't seen in other games. There are some other elements of Inkbound that sell it, like co-op, lots of progression and cosmetics, and a detailed, though admittedly obtuse, story. I really liked it as a whole. Negatives-wise, while I personally love the vestige variety and playstyle differences across characters, I'm sure some people will feel that the characters don't vary enough run to run and want a little more enemy and boss variety as well. The game also starts really easy until you climb a couple of difficulty levels. Also, historically, the game had several other problems at launch, being a live service game with a battle pass and an always online requirement, though those concerns have been mostly addressed now. I would strongly recommend Inkbound, even if you're not normally a turn-based fan. I was really excited to see this next game, Vertical Kingdom, since I first played the demo during a Steam Next Fest a couple years ago. It's a city builder roguelite where you unlock and purchase cards within your run, and you use those cards to place buildings that can stack on top of each other vertically. You can also occasionally fuse cards together to create new buildings. Like any good city builder, you're also managing a population of workers, resource gain and spend, providing various amenities, and completing various tasks. While I was really excited to try it again, I feel very mixed on this game now. On the one hand, I do enjoy that core city building gameplay with cards, combos, and interesting use of vertical space and layers. But I think the actual roguelite elements are kind of a flop. They just don't work well. The pacing for unlocking new buildings feels off as you play more. You have to re-unlock certain buildings within the same run because each run is split into different settlements that feel somewhat repetitive. And while there is some cross-run progression in the form of vertical progression or buffs, it just feels like something's missing there as well. So I think Vertical Kingdom can be a fun game to explore and experiment with city building wise, but I just don't think it's particularly good as a roguelite specifically. Megaloot is a streamlined RPG with a roguelite gameplay loop. Each turn, you can modify your gear and use the shop, but otherwise, your only action is choosing which enemy to attack. In that sense, the game is mostly build crafting with a hint of target prioritization. It reminds me of auto battlers with shops where you can combine items of lower rarities to get more powerful, higher tier version of the same items. Build crafting wise, you're collecting and equipping gear that gives you various stats and set effects. For example, one run might focus on a build that gives you a lot of health and lifesteal so you stay alive while attacking enemies, while another might focus on giving you mana and powerful spells with set effects that might increase the power or types of spells available to you. I think Megaloot mostly succeeds on what it sets out to do. It's an addictive gameplay loop that allows you to more purely focus on fun build crafting. But while I really loved playing through this game for the first 4 or so hours, my interest dropped off pretty hard after that point. The lack of final boss is a negative for me. The later enemies hard counter certain build types in a way I found to be unfun. And ultimately, it doesn't take that long to feel like you've tried all of the main build types that exist in the game. Combining those things with that simple core combat, while I still got my money's worth, the limited playtime makes it hard for me to recommend. Wild Bastards is another game from the studio behind Void Bastards. You play as a misfit of mutants, xenos, and robots. I think it's first worth mentioning that I wouldn't consider this game to be a true roguelite, so it's more like Void Bastards in that sense. You play through a campaign with randomized space systems, randomized ground maps, and encounters. The core gameplay has a mix of a turn-based overworld with set objectives and roaming enemies. When you encounter enemies, you have short fights with them, which are pretty straightforward kill all enemy type encounters. You can take 2 characters into each encounter and swap between them like swapping weapons. Between encounters and maps, you can gear up your characters, level them up with traits, and manage relationships between your crew. Honestly, I was incredibly disappointed in this game. I think it does some things well. I like the character design, and they have nicely different kits and ultimate abilities. The biggest problem for me is that the gameplay is really broken up and fragmented, with how often you have to manage overworld things and navigate the map. When you actually are in encounters, it felt like I spent most of the time just chasing down the last few enemies that kept hiding or running away. It just felt tedious. And you're doing the actual FPS gameplay, the reason that I'm playing an FPS game, way less frequently than I would hope for. I also think the Western vibe that they're going for just really missed for me, and I found it grating instead of charming. So yeah, I really did not like this game, and I can't really recommend it. But when you're actually playing those small slivers of FPS gameplay, it's enjoyable enough, I guess. Breach Wanderers is a card game roguelite that tries to keep some familiar roguelite card game elements while adding some non-roguelite card game mechanics like card collecting elements and more pre-run deck management. When starting a run, you can choose a default deck, a customized deck, or draft mode, where you make your starting deck from randomized choices. The gameplay and turns themselves will feel mostly familiar to roguelike card game fans, where you use energy to play cards, but it is notable for keeping energy across turns. Other notable combat mechanics include a fatigue mechanic when you draw too many cards in a given turn, excellent status effects with a unique status effect bar, and a good variety of character mechanics across 9 different characters. Notable non-combat related elements include heavy progression, including both general and character-specific vertical progression, quests and achievement tasks to complete, and card packs to open. For me, Breach Wanderer is good, but not great. It's definitely in the better half of card game roguelites, but it also notably falls short of games like Slay the Spire. I like some of the twists, like the draft mode and how the status effects works. But I also wish that some of that progression was just quicker and that it didn't take so long to unlock quote-unquote full runs because they require so many quests. I think it's worth grabbing for some card game roguelite fans out there that want that unique pre-run deck building or some variants like the status effects, but it's definitely not at the level of a must-buy. Yet another card game roguelite, Wildfrost, is one that I originally overlooked due to negative reception on release, but I've been having a great time with it recently. Unlike a lot of other card game roguelites, it doesn't fall into that Slay the Spire-like mold. First, the game uses a game board of 2 lanes with 3 columns each for enemies and allies. It's a very unit-focused roguelite, with your leader being one such unit that must be protected or you lose. Units can be moved freely between turns, to allow for strategic micromanagement as well. I really loved this tactical element, and I loved having fun combos with unit stacking niche effects or countering enemies in different ways. Instead of using energy to play cards, each card played counts as a turn, which then allows units to perform their actions. Instead of being automatic, you have to manually choose when you want to redraw your hand, which sometimes has a cost. These changes make the game feel unique moment to moment, but they also change how the balancing and build crafting feel in a way that I really appreciated as someone who's played a lot of card game roguelites that feel somewhat similar at their core. In terms of downsides, this game isn't necessarily super hard, but it is super punishing. It's very easy to misplay one turn and immediately lose your run due to missing an enemy effect or misplacing your leader because there's so many units and effects to keep track of. Still, I've been enjoying my time with Wildfrost so far. I would still recommend it right now for those that want a more unit-focused card game or just one that deviates more from that Slay the Spire mold. Astral Ascent is a 2D platformer roguelite that really surprised me. You play as 4 characters, or 5 characters with the DLC, who have unique movesets, potential spells, and signature abilities. Builds come from comboing your spells, stacking passives on those spells and your attacks, and picking up powerful auras with unique combos and synergies. The game has incredible boss design, with 13 total bosses you can encounter, and has incredible room variety as well, with rooms ranging from standard kill all enemy type rooms, to run and gun type rooms, to more niche challenge rooms. Like I said, I was really surprised by this game in a positive way. The combat can feel light and floaty at times, but I think it fits the game really well. I love the build crafting and how things can come together, as well as the unique synergies that some of these auras allow for across elemental types. But really, the strongest point of Astral Ascent for me was that incredible boss design, and how each of the 12 Zodiac bosses felt both fun to learn and also distinct from each other. The game has an anime feel at times with how it plays, as well as various in-game cutscenes, lore entries, and dialogue, which range from super fun to pretty cheesy. In terms of drawbacks, some people won't love that floaty combat, some won't love the limitation and forced cycling of the spell system, and some people won't love that super extensive and overcomplicated progression system. But for me, I did love my time with it, and definitely recommend it to action roguelite fans out there. Spiritfall is another platform fighter roguelite that I played this year. In each run, you clear small rooms of enemies that spawn in waves. The combat itself involves directional attacks, air attacks, and comboing reminiscent of Smash or Brawlhalla. Along each run, you can collect upgrades that improve your attacks and abilities, as well as more general passive buffs. The build crafting in this game feels heavily inspired by Hades, with different spirits giving you upgrades of different styles. There's a fairly straightforward progression system as well, with ample vertical progression included. Overall, I think the core gameplay of Spiritfall is solid and fun. It's fun to combo enemies and send them flying. It's fun to create some powerful builds centered around each spirit, and it's fun to try out the different weapons the game has. But the game is just missing a little something to make it great, take it to that next level. For example, while the build crafting can make you feel powerful, it's also fairly closed off in terms of what you can do. The synergies that do exist feel prescribed, as opposed to other games where it feels like you can more organically find your own synergies. The enemy variety in this game could use some improvement as well. Because of that core gameplay, Spiritfall is fun and worth playing, but I just wish it did a little bit more. While writing the script, I realized that they've added a lot of updates to the game since I last played, so it's possible that some of those have been addressed, but I personally haven't seen it yet. Another action roguelite that I played this year was Warm Snow. Honestly, the actual action part of this action game is fairly straightforward. You have a dodge and 2 or 3 damaging abilities that interact, but for some characters or god sets, it's literally just a basic attack. That simple core gameplay, though, is more than compensated by the incredibly fun build crafting. One of the unique elements in that build crafting is the ability to move the same relic between 4 different slots to have different effects. There are also more standard modifiers and different classes that play meaningfully different and have distinct build focuses. Each character set has their own possible modifiers as well you can find on runs that allow for character-specific builds and combos. And you can have some incredibly powerful and effect-heavy builds. I had so much fun creating busted builds, like one that spammed repeated lightning effects on enemies and things like that. And you kind of need those builds to be busted as you climb difficulty levels because enemies can get almost boringly spongy at the highest difficulty. However, I do like the difficulty levels in this game because they add more gameplay elements and improve build crafting as you climb them. There are 2 DLC in this game, one of which is free, but I haven't fully explored them yet. Even without them though, the base game is already incredible. If you want a build crafting focused action roguelite, I think Warm Snow can be a great pickup. Just keep in mind, it's not a game that's going to allow great skill expression in the combat itself outside of well-timed dodges. Berserk Mode originally caught my eye as a unique FPS roguelite. It's channeling Boomer Shooter energy with magic, swords, and a beast form, aka Berserk Mode. At its core, the game is super straightforward. In each room, you try to get to the portal to the next room, sometimes needing to clear rooms of enemies along the way. You're also constantly draining health, so you have to keep killing enemies in order to keep healing. You'll also occasionally activate your beast mode, which gives you powerful attacks and allows you to deal massive damage. Runs in this game are super short, and the game in general feels frantic with how you're zooming around and how easy it is to die. I had some fun trying out this game, trying out the different weapons and areas, and experiencing some of that fast-paced action. But it's just not a game that had a lot of depth for me. The builds were basic, the enemy variety is fairly straightforward, and it just feels a little shallow throughout. As a result, I had fun messing around with it for an hour or two, but it very quickly dropped off after that. That being said, the game often goes on sale for barely over $1, so it might still be worth a couple runs at that price point. Riftbound is a lane-based tower defense game that basically tries to be a roguelike twist on Plants vs. Zombies. You have basic economic resource management, towers of different types that counter different enemies, and spells you can activate to help your defense. You also have the ability to create hero units, which are buff towers with various additional effects. In addition to the roguelite mode, the game has a campaign mode as well. I liked the premise and core gameplay of Riftbound. I think it's a nice take on that Plants vs. Zombie formula with the addition of spells and hero units. It was fun to combo specific spells and towers together, and the boss encounters in this game felt well designed. That being said, I found the actual roguelite elements themselves to be lacking and underwhelming. The upgrades are often small stat increases, which felt kind of boring, and the overall pacing felt off with how often you get upgrades and the length of each encounter. There was a big free expansion, Demon Lore, in October, which improved on some of these systems, and I haven't fully explored the game since then, but based on my past experience, it's a decent game as a whole, but a little underwhelming as a roguelite specifically. Pirates Outlaws is a card game roguelite in that classic Slay the Spire style. You have a turn, play cards for ammo, and then let the enemy attack. You can upgrade your cards and get powerful relics. This game has a lot of streamlined mechanics and limitations, which makes sense given that it was ported over from mobile. For example, each character can only have one status or debuff effect, which limits certain builds, but also leads to unique interactions, where you can remove an enemy's buff by applying a status condition. In many ways, Pirates Outlaws is a great game. It has an incredible amount of character variety with different decks and mechanics, lots of different areas to explore where you can go on different runs. It has different game modes, and it has a large amount of progression, quests to complete, and cosmetics to unlock. But something about it makes me always bounce off of it quickly whenever I come back to try it. I think the biggest thing is that the build crafting balance just feels off to me. It doesn't feel like I'm getting satisfying deck smokes runs, and some of the limitations of the game seem to ruin certain builds, like bosses often blocking condition builds, or being forced to always take cards when they're offered. So I still think Pirates Outlaws is a good roguelike card game with a lot of content that could keep somebody occupied for a long period of time. But honestly, that somebody has not been me so far. Next up, Arboria is a third-person action roguelite with Souls-like combat. You always have 2 weapons you can use, along with various abilities and items. The weapon variety here is great, with a lot of different movesets and effects available. The build crafting is fun and focuses on those different weapons, as well as different elemental types and effects that counter enemies that have similar elemental types. There's good variety there as a result. Importantly, Arboria is a roguelite with a hefty amount of progression, especially vertical progression. It also has a system where you unlock the ability to skip easy, earlier areas to get to later, harder areas faster. Though there are some gameplay mechanics that incentivize farming early areas every run. In comparison to standard roguelites, I really think of Arboria as similar to Rogue Legacy where your main goal is often to farm progression for future runs, as opposed to expecting to get a win or a clear on a given run. As I said, I like the combat, the build crafting, and the enemy variety. But this game has two main flaws for me. First, the game is janky and buggy. There are invisible walls, enemies hitting you through walls, things like that, a little too often. Second, the last area in this game feels unfinished and incredibly tedious compared to all the areas before. Outside of that, the heavy vertical progression is well done, but it's definitely stronger than some people want. So I think Arboria is worth checking out. I had fun with it, but you have to go into it knowing that it has those notable flaws. Let's start talking about a couple early access titles that I played this year. Hades 2 is probably the release that I was most excited about in 2024, and I've had an amazing time with it so far. You return to this world of Greek mythology and play as the daughter of Hades to fight against Kronos. The game has familiar isometric action roguelike gameplay, but it has a different set of weapons than Hades 1, and it has some changes to your core moveset as well, with charged abilities that cost mana and a new sprint ability replacing repeat dodges. The game has an incredible set of bosses, and notably has two separate run paths. I've really enjoyed Hades 2 so far. I think Supergiant Games did a great job of evolving their formula in a way that involves both some direct improvements, like adding two separate paths, and some more personal preference choices that make Hades 1 and 2 feel distinct, like making Melanoi's moveset feel different than Zagreus's. I also love some of their experimentation with more build crafting avenues and more ways to make busted builds, though it does come at some RNG costs. And of course, the game is the same quality of art style, music, and conversations that Hades 1 had. So I definitely recommend Hades 2. I think it's already worth grabbing, but I've put it down for now to wait for that 1.0 full release with the complete package. After talking about Hades 2, let's talk about another game that was clearly inspired by Hades, Realm of Ink. It's a Chinese-themed isometric action roguelite with light attacks, heavy attacks, a dodge, and additional active abilities as well. You often lean into an attack spam heavy feel, and you clear rooms of enemies to get various room rewards. These rewards create your build by modifying your moveset, giving more active abilities, unique passive effects, and other smaller stat increases. It also has a lot of NPC dialogue and lore entries. I think it's worth reiterating that just looking at it, it has a very similar style to Hades gameplay-wise, and probably too similar for some people. But I still really enjoy it, and I would recommend the game to people who are Hades fans that want a slightly different take on it. I think the build crafting feels sufficiently different than Hades with how the perks and ink gems work, and the enemies and bosses were also sufficiently different for me. I really enjoyed creating OP builds in this game and trying out all the different characters. I think the biggest missing area for me right now are some additions to specific build crafting elements, like more ink gems, to just add some more build variety to those parts. Also, this game definitely needs some more difficulty levels because I've kind of capped out the challenge already, but those are all being addressed, hopefully, in early access. From one of the makers of Dead Cells, the Rogue Prince of Persia is a side-scrolling action roguelite. The combat feels unique compared to other action roguelites, and also compared to Dead Cells. It has an acrobatic feel with how you move and attack. Instead of dodging, you vault over enemies, and there are myriad walls to jump on and poles to swing around. The build crafting is more straightforward, with an interesting medallion system and swappable weapons. The progression has a mix of unlocking items for future run and a vertical progression upgrade tree. When I played this game, it had just released in early access. I felt it had a fun, unique core, and it felt distinct from Dead Cells in that core gameplay loop, although a lot of the meta progression elements felt very Dead Cells-esque to me. But I think this game just doesn't have sufficient content yet, and more critically, the build crafting system feels underwhelming to me, and I never created any deep or satisfying or memorable builds. And for that reason, this game is worth following, but I don't see a rush to go out and buy it yet. It did have a huge update earlier this month, which allegedly doubled the amount of content, but I haven't played it yet, so I don't have anything to say about it. Gatekeeper is a game most concisely described as if somebody wanted to make Risk of Rain in an isometric format. The characters, the environment, the build crafting are all Risk of Rain-esque, and they're all pretty fun. The characters have a great variety of kits, and they all have some fun inter-kit synergy and mechanics. In one run type, you clear enemies in rooms with a mix of objectives ranging from kill all enemies to more defense-oriented events. In the other run type, you just clear waves of enemies. Along the way, you earn cash that you spend at shrines to give stackable items with buffs ranging from a chance of exploding enemies to chaining attacks to nearby enemies via lightning to dealing constant damage to nearby enemies. You can also level up your stats and abilities to grant them new effects and synergies. As a whole, Gatekeeper's fun. I like the classes, I like the vibe, and I had some fun builds. It probably gets a little too close to that source material, and sometimes I wonder if I should just go play Risk of Rain instead of Gatekeeper. I'm also a little concerned with the direction they're taking with the game. The last big content update added some more good content, but it also notably worsened the build crafting pacing, in my opinion. So I still think it's fun, but honestly, I'm waiting to see how more updates pan out before I solidly recommend it. The final FPS roguelite that I played this year was Get to the Orange Door, which is even more explicitly a movement shooter than Deadlink. You zoom around the map, kill enemies, and complete defend events and boss battles before moving on to the next stage. You loot caches, complete challenges, and find secret buffs. Enemies progressively get harder and spawn in new types as you progress during your run. At a first glance, Get to the Orange Door was a game I was super excited for. It just looked fun and it looked unique. And when it all comes together, it is really fun, with responsive guns and thrilling movement. But I had a lot of complaints that ruined my enjoyment and my desire to play more. The game needs more progression before it feels like you really get going. I got seemingly soft-locked on some bosses when I ran out of ammo. The build crafting was underwhelming. But really the biggest flaw for me was that it seemed like the shooter and the movement mechanics were completely separate. It felt like I was almost swapping back and forth between a Mirror's Edge-like game and a more straightforward FPS game. But they rarely meshed in a way that was satisfying. I haven't played this game in about a year, so maybe some of those concerns have been addressed, but I was incredibly let down at the time, and I haven't wanted to go back since. Dungeon Clawler is another game that tries to expand the core concept of deck building into a new game type. There is the physics claw machine part and the basic fight below. If you've played Peglin, this game feels very similar, but obviously with a claw machine instead of Peggle. Here, you use said claw machine to pick up goodies that give your characters attacks, shield, and other various buffs and debuffs. You use those to help stay alive and clear out enemies. The build crafting comes in to how you add more pieces to your machine and how they synergize, such as adding more metal pieces to your machine and then adding a magnet that groups all those pieces together, makes them easier to grab. There are also different characters and grabbers, like a magnet grabber that feeds into that same metal-focused build. I liked that build crafting and those synergies. The devs clearly thought through how they want to make enjoyable build crafting. But I feel like the game needs more variety-wise, especially because that core gameplay loop, while fun, is ultimately so simple. In short, Dungeon Clawler has fun, unique gameplay already, but the more long-term replayability is kind of up in the air for me. It needs more variety. We'll see how that changes during the rest of early access. Emberward is a tower defense game with a twist. You use Tetris-like pieces, create the path that your enemies will take, as well as create the actual spaces you need to place your towers. The tower defense part mixes familiar elements with that tile placement mechanic. Some towers take up 1 tile, some take up 4, and some take up specific arrangements, like being placed over the enemy's walking path in order to be effective. The game also has multiple more active elements, like limited active power-ups that can be used on towers when applicable. You can start the game with different characters and flames that add different passive effects and combine with those relics you find within each run. Emberward is great. It's 100% worth grabbing or wishlisting if you want a roguelite tower defense game. It's a true modern tower defense game that takes that simple TD core, does it well, and then runs with it with a novel twist of maze building. I really loved building winding mazes for enemies. I love clearing different maps and stages. And the standard roguelite build crafting elements are all satisfactory, though also nothing super special at the moment. 2 main issues with Emberward right now. 1, that long-term replayability is hurt by the lack of true difficulty levels. And 2, there's decent, but not amazing run-to-run build crafting and area variety. But still, I'm really excited to see what they keep adding to this game, and I plan to keep playing it. Now let's talk about one DLC. Against the Storm is one of my favorite roguelites, so I was incredibly excited when they released Keepers of the Stone. If you're not familiar with the base game, it's a city builder roguelite that does amazing on both the city building and the roguelite elements. This DLC added another species of villager, another 2 biomes, and a couple smaller upgrades, orders, and cornerstones, which are the passive effects you can stack. The DLC also comes with a big update to the base game that adds new raw materials, the fishing mechanic, and new recipes, pathways, and building balance as a result of those changes. I love this DLC because at its core, it just adds more fun variety and new mechanics to one of my favorite games. The frogs have some unique qualities, like needing species-specific homes, and I quite enjoyed the 2 new biomes. I've had more success with the Coastal Grove, but I like being able to create my own unique cornerstones and passive buffs with Ashen Thicket. That being said, this is hardly a necessary DLC. The core game of Against the Storm is already great without it, and the DLC just adds more variety and intricacies. It is a $15 DLC for a $30 game, and a lot of negative reviews are surrounding that value for dollar question. The DLC actually originally only came with 1 biome, but they added a second one a couple weeks ago to help address that. If you already love the base game, I think it's great, and I love the DLC in terms of the quality of the content. But if you only not love the base game, or if you're more pressed for cash, it might be worth waiting for that DLC to go on sale as opposed to buying it outright. Before I conclude with some favorites and standouts from the year, I want to point out a couple things. First, some of these games are given to me for free by developers to try, as shown on screen now. Second, I technically did include some games that I played last year instead of this year, but I never did a 2023 roundup, so they were snuck into this one. Along with that, some of these games have had updates since I last played them, so they could be in a different state now than when I played them. I did go back to see how some of these games are now, but for the sake of time and actually getting this video out, I didn't go back to every single game. There are also always more games that I want to play, but I didn't have time for, like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Splintered Fate, for example. And there are also some that I played a little bit of, but not quite enough yet to warrant reviewing, like Windblown or Raven's Watch. Another notable release I didn't play was the second DLC for Risk of Rain 2, Seekers of the Storm. If you didn't follow the news there, it released with some game-breaking bugs, even for the base game, which included potentially losing save data on console. The items and the new survivors were also panned as unbalanced and unfun. It was so bad the Gearbox had to announce a roadmap with months of updates just to fix all those issues. So I don't plan on buying it and touching it until they finish those updates at the bare minimum. So now some closing thoughts on this year or so in roguelites. Despite some disappointments, I think it was a great year, especially for action roguelites. We had Hades 2 and Realm of Ink released in early access, which already feel incredibly solid. And we had Rogue, Prince of Persia, and Windblown, which need a little more work, but have some great potential. I also loved playing Warm Snow and Astral Ascent this year. And there was even that Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle roguelite that I mentioned earlier that I haven't had a chance to explore yet. It was also a great time for me to revisit some games that initially had bad receptions, but I grew to love, namely Wildfrost and Inkbound, which later became one of my favorite games of the year. So, commentary of the year aside, I'll give 3 recommendations of my favorite roguelites in 2024 across different genres. These will be full release games, aka not early access, not DLC. In terms of action roguelites, I loved Astral Ascent for its build crafting and its boss variety. So that's my action roguelite recommendation for 2024. I recommend Balatro for being a truly unique roguelite card game. Honestly, it was really incredible to see a true indie roguelite win 3 different awards at the Game Awards this year. So I love that representation as well. Balatro definitely deserved it. Finally, I'll recommend Inkbound for a turn-based game of the year. I really loved how fluid it felt despite being turn-based, and I loved the build crafting and the choices it allowed for. Because of that, it became one of my go-to games for quite a few months this year. My honorable mentions will be Warm Snow and Wildfrost. I still want to play the DLC for Warm Snow, and I still want to progress a little further in Wildfrost before I fully finish judging it. That being said, I really love the build crafting of Warm Snow as it is right now. You can create some really fun and overpowered builds, and I really like the different approach to card game roguelites that Wildfrost is, with its unique unit-focused and different moment-to-moment feel. If you're new here, I had similar roundups for 3 of the last 4 years, if you want to check those out, linked in the description of this video. I also have longer reviews of a lot of these games as well that you can find on my channel. Huge shout out to all of our channel members for helping support the channel. Please like this video to help me out in the algorithm, and thanks for watching.